so now that we know some of the basics for Java programming, now we actually need to accomplish something. So the particular project that I'm going to be looking at is something titled Guessing Game. The idea is that you're going to have the computer pick a random number between 0 and 100, inclusive, meaning 0 and 100 are part of it. The user gets to guess a number, and the computer tells you if you're too high, too low, or if you're just right. This is kind of like Goldilocks. If it is correct, it'll display how many guesses it took too, so we're going to need some way of counting how many times they've guessed. And then ask if you want to play again. So the way we're going to do this is we're actually going to use a few methods that are built into Java, kind of like system out println. We're going to use a random number creator to do the random thing. We need to be able to input a line, kind of like we did system.out, only opposite of that. And we need to be able to convert between different kinds of information. So if we have a string, we need to be able to change to an int. If we have an int, we need to be able to change to a string, things like that. Java is a strongly typed language, so if it's asking for a string, you cannot put anything else except a string inside of that line. Okay, so what are some useful functions? Well, one of the first things was random. So there is a function in the math class called math.random. So what this does is, if I hover over it, it tells me, returns a double value with a positive sign greater than or equal to 0 and less than 1. So it doesn't include 1.0. I can get a number between 0 and 1, except I want a number between 0 and 100. How do I do that? Well, what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to say, multiply this by maybe 100. So it's going to be a number between 0 and 0.9999999, so on. And then I'm going to multiply it by 100. So that's going to give me a number between 0 and 99.99999, so on. That's almost right. I need 101 to actually get the full amount. And maybe I'll store this in a variable. So how about random num? And I'll say equals that. Now it's still complaining, and the problem is, let's see, type mismatch cannot convert from double to int. Math.random is a double. When I multiply it by an integer, which 101 is, it's all still a double because it uses the more precise number. So in order to put this into an integer, I need to do casting. So I put parentheses around this whole thing, make this an int. All right, let's try printing that out and see if it really does act like a random number. Okay, run this. 41. That does seem pretty random. 93. 80. Okay, that satisfies me as being a random number. Okay, I know how to print things out. Another thing that you can do, by the way, is you can actually combine different kinds of things in the system out print line. So I can combine an int with a series of letters, for example. So in the system out print line, maybe it's something I would like to do is say this is a random number and then have the number afterwards. So what I can do is I can have something in quotes and then use a plus sign with the number. What it'll do is it'll take this thing, which is a string, this thing, which is an integer, and change the integer into a string. Whenever you use a plus sign, with, which contains a string and basically anything else, it converts the anything else part into a string and combines them together. So this is a random number. I'm going to put a colon plus random num. So this is the part that was the string. Here's the random number converted. And it basically puts them all together. This is called string concatenation, is the fancy term of basically making everything a string and slapping it all together. And I can actually use a series of things. So let's say I wanted a period at the end. I could do plus a period. By the way, if I wanted a space after the colon but before the number, you can actually put a space in as part of the string. Okay, so I can output whatever I want. How about inputting things? We're going to be using a class called scanner. I mentioned this in the requirements here. A scanner is a special Java object that's pre-built, and it allows you to get a line of text. Actually, you can get a line of a number of different things. You can get integers and whatnot, but we're going to be using it for text. So scanner, I need to give this scanner a name. Scanner with lowercase maybe. As long as I don't use uppercase, it means it's not a class. Equals a new scanner. So you notice it's complaining about this. So scanner is not part of the standard library. It's one of the extended libraries. So what we need to do is we need to import the class, well, the library basically that scanner is contained in. In Eclipse, it's pretty easy. If you hover over it, there's this thing down here that says import scanner, which is exactly what we want to do. So java.util contains a number of different classes that are useful, and the scanner class happens to be in there. So if we want to use it, all we say is import java.util.scanner. And what I did by clicking on the automatic import thing is it just added that line for me. Kind of handy. Now it's still complaining over here, and the reason why is I'm not completely right on this line here. I need to give it which line where I'm reading from. So I'm reading from system in. I'm going to read from the console down at the bottom. So I need to put that in the parentheses. So actually, typing things in down here in the console is how I read in from system in. So let's try reading something in from there. So I'm going to create a string input and say it's equal to scanner dot next line. So next line allows me to read in one line of text, put it into input. And let's just print them back out again, see what happened. It's always a good idea to test every few lines of code to make sure your code is still working. If you type 20 lines of code and it breaks, one of those 20 lines was wrong and you have to try and find it. If you type in 2 lines of code, you know it's one of those 2 lines you just put in, and it's much easier to trace. You typed plus input. So down here, notice that it's still running. The red box shows that it hasn't terminated yet. So it's waiting for me to type something down here. So if I put my cursor down here and say, I am typing, you typed, I am typing. Okay, cool. Now, in the guessing game, we're actually guessing numbers, and we need to use numbers to figure out whether it's greater or less than this random number up here. So how do I change from a string to a number? It turns out that the capital I integer class has something that we're going to use. So let's try saying int guess equals, and if I just say input, it's like, no, you can't do that. Cannot convert from string to int. I actually have to change the string into an integer. It's an object type, so it turns out it's more complicated than just casting it. We actually need to run it through a function to get what we want. And the function we want is capital I integer dot parse capital I int. And then the thing we want to put in parentheses is the thing that we're going to convert. So it's actually really easy to change anything into a string. So for example, I just add on a string to it, and it converts this int into a string. Going the other way is not so easy. So I actually have to use capital I integer dot parse int with a capital I, and then put my string in there, and it turns it into a guess. Well, into an int guess. So let's try printing this out once I have converted it. Now this isn't going to be much different from printing out a string because this converts automatically. Let's make sure this works to begin with. So 43, enter, you type 43, that's the int. So the reason I need to do this is if I have an if statement, I can say something like if guess is less than 10, I can say that. So for an if statement's purposes, you can only do less than and greater than with a number. This is a random number, 1. So let's say I say 5. You type 5. 5, guess is less than 10. Okay, good. So it took the number the string 5, change it into a number, and then I can use that in if statement. If I try and use input here, it's not valid. You can't use a string and try and use less than or greater than. A series of characters, it doesn't know what to do with that. It's not a number, so how do you say it's less than the pound sign or a period or whatever that is? So that's why I have to convert it. All right, so there we go. That's kind of the idea for that. I kind of went over how to add 1 to something so that we can figure out how many guesses there are. So we just need another variable which keeps track of how many times we've guessed. So we're going to have an int, which is how many guesses you have. What about this play again thing? That's kind of tricky. So we need some way of basically repeating this guessing stuff in our actual project. So we're going to need a while loop for that. So what I'm probably going to do is I'm going to have some way of keeping track of whether or not I've guessed the right thing yet. So this whole section here has to do with inputting things and then checking guesses. So I probably want some sort of while statement that goes around this whole thing. By the way, you can highlight the whole thing and hit tab to go 1 tab in. And also, if you tab too far, if you hold on shift and tab, you can go backwards. Kind of handy. So maybe I want to say while guess is not equal to random num. Do this loop over and over again. Oh, it's complaining about guess. Guess is created inside of here. So this has to do with the scope of things. If I create guess inside here, I can't use it before that. So guess has to be defined before I get to this while statement. So I'm going to want to create guess out here. And I want to not say int here, so I don't try and recreate it inside this loop. Now, I haven't given guess a value yet, so I should probably do that. Let's make it, well, if I pick 0 to 100, that's kind of bad because it might be the random number. So let's say -1. So it's going to do this while loop over and over again while the guess is not equal to the random num. As soon as it does, and it gets to the end here, it'll stop executing it. What about playing again? I kind of want to do this whole thing while the program is still running. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a Boolean, still playing, and set it equal to true. And I'm going to put a while statement around this whole thing, which says, while still playing is true. Braces around all of this code. All of this should happen while we're still playing. So once I get out of this loop, because I've guessed the right thing, I need to check another string and see if they say yes or no as far as wanting to play again. So what I can do is I can say system.out.println play again. I should spell this correctly. That will help. Java is pickier about spelling than any English teacher you have ever had, ever. So now I need to read in an input. So input, let's see. I defined string input inside of here, so I'm going to need a different string. How about yes, no, because that's the thing I'm asking about. Next line. And then I need to ask some question about yes or no. So the tempting thing to do is say, if yes, no equals equals yes, or yes, no equals equals no. Well, how about this? If yes, no equals yes or y, then we're going to do, how about still playing is true? And else still playing equals false. So if it's false, it gets to here, still playing becomes false, so if it's not true, it just continues on and ends the program. If we say yes, then still playing will be true, it'll start back up here at the top and do the whole thing over again. It turns out this doesn't quite work, unfortunately, and the reason why is that yes, no is a string. Strings don't behave correctly with two equal signs. It turns out there's another way you can check for equality with them. What you have to do is you say yes, no, period, and then you spell out equals. And then in the parentheses here, you put in yes in quotes. So that's how you check an object to see if it's equal to another object. Since a string is an object type, you have to use the first one, period equals, and the second one goes in the parentheses. The reason why is that a string is actually saved in a particular spot of memory, and so it's actually checking, is the memory here, in this example, equal to the memory of a temporary string y? If you want to actually see if the letters inside of them are the same, that's why we have to use the dot equals. The long and short of it is, use dot equals when you're comparing strings to each other. So that'll allow me to check it. I think that's enough to get you through the guessing game.